Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I'm the host of Reformed GGA, and today I wanted to talk to you guys about my first and also probably last range session with the Fostech AK-47 Echo binary trigger. As that introduction would imply, it didn't go overly well, and it didn't go overly well basically from the beginning. So to recap the series of events, I got it in the mail and have the open little plastic insert thing that it comes in here. Okay, so the trigger's up here, the little selector lever is down here, and then there's some screws and Allen wrenches and whatnot in the bottom compartment. It comes in this little plastic container. And so took it home, got it out, read the material on it, usual disclaimers and all those kinds of things. We are not responsible for anything whatsoever that may or may not happen to you. Now go have fun, basically. Was more or less the gist of it, and that's normal for these kinds of products. And so I got it out, read through the instructions on how to install it, looked at some videos, including Fostech's video that they have out there on YouTube on how to install it and all those kinds of things, and sat there saying, okay, I'm good. And it turns out that the particular gun that I wanted to put it in, it does not work with particularly well. And that is where I'm putting most of the blame for the bad experience. I put it in my Palmetto State Armory AK-47 GF3, and it turns out that this gun and this trigger assembly just simply don't work together very well. It doesn't mean that PSA necessarily makes bad AKs. I actually like this one quite a bit. I originally didn't think I was going to like it so much, but it turns out I actually really do like it quite a bit, and that's why I got the binary trigger for it. But yeah, it just kind of wound up going from bad to worse rather quickly. So last night, got it in the mail, opened it up, read through it, looked at the YouTube videos, and then I got into taking apart my AK, and basic disassembly and whatnot is all the same. Top cover comes off in the normal way. And take out the recoil spring in the normal way. Bolts and bolt carrier come out in the normal way when you have the safety off, at least. That part is all normal. Safety comes out in the normal way. All of that is all fine and dandy, but once you get into the inside and you need to take apart the guts in there, things got a little bit weird. PSA, like a lot of companies, uses a retaining plate for their fire control group. And let's see if I can get this thing braced so you can see it. There's a little tab that you can see in there. A little tab next to my index finger is where the plate basically begins. And so I'm sitting there messing with this thing, trying to pull it out, because I see on most of the videos that the tab, the little retaining plate, comes out really easy, and I'm sitting here fiddling with this thing trying to yank on it, and it's not coming out at all. And so I go searching the internet for people who have figured out how to take the retaining plate out of their PSA, and it turns out that you basically need to pry it out. So I wound up getting a couple of screwdrivers, one to lift up on the tab and another screwdriver to push it out from the body of the receiver to yank the thing out of there, and eventually got that out. Then got the hammer assembly taken out, and that went out fairly easily, and then tried taking out the trigger assembly, and it was a royal pain in the rear. The pin that holds in the trigger assembly was in there really tight, and it's still in there really tight, just because that's how it works. And I'm sitting there treating it fairly gently, trying to coax it out, and it's not going anywhere. And eventually I took basically the biggest driver that would fit in the hole and my hammer, and I just pounded on the thing until I eventually drove out the pin that was in there, and got it all out and said, okay, at least that part is done. It's good. From here, smooth sailing. No, it wasn't smooth sailing from there. So I got all those innards taken out, And then came time to drop in the wonderful Fostech Echo binary trigger. I was so excited. I had taken off the actual trigger piece itself because you have to do that to actually fit it in. So I slid it in there, and it actually slid in just fine. You slide it in the back end and under, and then you start attaching everything, and it starts looking pretty good, and I'm getting excited because everything's going along pretty smoothly. And okay, got the trigger assembly in the main housing, and it's looking good, and it's kind of this this brass color, and so it's sitting in there, and it's all nice and shiny. And I put in the cross pins that it comes with and all those other things. And the instructions that they provide and the online YouTube video that Fostech made about how to do this were actually very clear and very easy to follow, so all that was great. It went in pretty stinking easy up until the point where I had gotten the fire control group replaced. So I got all that replaced, and then it was time to reassemble the other components of the firearm. Well, it's not going to have a safety I don't have to reassemble the safety anymore on it because it comes with its own little plate that has its own little selector switch and whatnot, so I don't have to worry about that. But I stick in the other components. I'm going to put the safety back in just for fun anyways. But I go to install the other bits, and of course one of those main bits that needs to go in is of course the bolts in the bolt carrier. So I go to put that in there, and usually the bolt carrier is a little snug over the fire control group, and then it should glide home pretty easily once you get past the fire control group. And this time, and when I had the Fostech trigger in there, it was pretty snug. It was pretty hard to get it pushed forward, but I did, and so I was like, well, okay, it's snug, but it's an AK. Things don't always fit perfectly anyways. Put in the buffer spring, and then I decided to function test like that without the cover on it so I can see what's going on. I pull back on the charging handle and release, and it stays there. Now, I've talked about this in other videos where I've reviewed this one. This one does tend to lock up a little bit. It doesn't cause any problems while firing because, it's just a little bit of tension and it goes through. And so at first I didn't consider it to be too big of a deal. That's kind of AKs for you. Sometimes the tolerances will create a little bit of a tension in a certain spot. And if you're just running it at hand speeds, sometimes it'll pause midway through, and while you're firing that doesn't happen because there's quite a bit more velocity involved, and so it's not an issue. But this one was doing it quite a bit in the process of testing it, and there's this little test sequence that you go through to make sure that the trigger is functioning correctly and all those kinds of things. And it was locking up quite a bit, more than it usually does, but at the same time it's an AK. You expect it to be just, well, it's an AK. You kind of expect it to have some weird issues with tolerances and whatnot. And while playing with it, at one point it actually got stuck pretty good, and so I'm kind of pushing on it, trying to get it to go down into the rails properly, and I wasn't keeping track of my fingers very well, and my index finger got caught just inside the rear end of the bolt carrier here, and it got smashed as I pushed the bolt home. So that was kind of a stupid on me, and that one hurt real bad. I'll tell you, I've gotten more hand injuries since I got into firearms than I ever had at any other points in my life. Just sticking fingers or forgetting where I'm sticking fingers, and then I get cut on the targets that get shot up because a lot of my target holders are metal, and so they get shot up and they have jagged edges and all kinds of things. Poor me, sad story, I know. Terrible that I stub my fingers from time to time and get little cuts. Just sad and awful. But anyways, that was how the evening went. I stuck it in there, and the bolt carrier was not sliding back and forth very well, and managed to get my finger caught in there at one point. So I was kind of miffed at that, but I figured, it's probably a wear-in issue, and like I said, just normally with the normal fire control group, this gun does tend to kind of lock up anyway, so I didn't consider it to be that big of a deal. I figure, once you get it firing with the full velocity of the rounds going off and whatnot, probably not going to be that big of an issue. AKs kind of do this. So this morning I go out and stick my little 10 rounder, because it's just easier to work off the bench with. Stick my little 10 rounder in the gun, and it's in. I go to charge it, and it locks again. It won't go forward, and the gun just locks up. The bolt won't go forward, and I also can't get the magazine out. And what I eventually wound up doing is basically mortaring the thing home to load around and then yank it back out to undo the round, and do that 10 times because it's a 10 round magazine. And once I got all the rounds out, then eventually I was able to yank the magazine free. But what had happened is that the Fostech trigger assembly has basically a little disconnector blade in it, this little silver bit here that goes up and down, that keeps the trigger from activating when the bolt is back. It's meant to be a safety device, but what happened is that little blade got jammed into the back of the magazine, and let's see, you can see it right there. It's not much. It's not much, but it got jammed in there enough that it froze up the system and kept everything from running like it was supposed to. So I'm sitting there looking at that. I was like, well, that's definitely not a good sign. And so I grab one of my other magazines that is a little bit more worn in, but you'll notice it wound up doing the same thing to it, but it was just more worn in, so it didn't wind up creating a big issue. But yeah, the little blade caught on the back of the magazine there as well. Granted, plastic magazines and AKs tend to fit a little bit more tightly than the metal ones do anyways. That's kind of normal. But still, went forward and started testing it, and eventually got to the point where I could load it and actually start firing, but it kept locking back. And of course, AKs don't have a last round bolt hold open or a lockback system. No, it just kept getting stuck in the action. Back here, I'm not sure if it was getting caught on the little disconnector blade, or if it was that the hammer puts too much tension upward. Whatever the case was, it just kept getting caught over the Fostech trigger. And when it go forward, and I would basically have to hit the charging handle with my thumb. It usually wasn't a ton of pressure, just hit it with my thumb, and then it would go forward, and then I'd be able to fire again. So I basically had a bolt action semi-auto, which is not overly useful, but messed around with that a little bit, and it started to loosen up a little bit and started to fire pretty consistently in semi-auto mode. And the Fostech binary trigger has a couple of different modes. It has normal semi-auto, and also has the binary mode. So eventually got it to the point where it seemed to be running decent in semi-auto. Things were starting to loosen up and whatnot. I was like, okay, this isn't as frustrating. This is working. Switch it over to binary mode. Pull back on for the first time. It sends off a round, and it's supposed to, in binary mode, release another round on when you release the trigger. And that happened. Except on that release, that firing sequence, it kept getting caught up in the action again. So I pull once, fire, release, and it would fire again, but then the action would get stuck, and I'd have to tap it home. And it usually wasn't too much. It was just a matter of hitting it with my thumb, and then it would go forward. But it kind of negates the whole purpose of having a binary trigger. The idea of a binary trigger is that you pull back and forth more or less like you normally would, but it releases twice as many rounds downrange, so it simulates a faster rate. Well, it creates a faster rate of fire. Something that would be more on line with, say, bump firing, or kind of a pseudo full auto feel, but not quite, but pseudo. That's the idea behind it, is to create a faster rate of fire. But on that second round, on the release round, it kept getting hung up, and so it didn't really fire all that fast. Problem after problem after problem after problem, and I stuck with it, saying, okay, maybe it'll wear out, and I wound up putting about 160 rounds through it all together. And the very last magazine, the binary trigger system was actually working more or less like it was supposed to. Pull, release, fire, fire, and it wasn't getting hung up. And I thought, okay, well, that's basically all the ammo that I took out here for this today, but you know, it looks somewhat promising. I did also have an issue of the selector switch starting to come loose, and that in and of itself doesn't really bug me that much. It just, you know, means that I didn't tighten it down enough when I first installed it, and that's not a huge issue in and of itself. Screws can be tightened. That's not a big deal. But when I got home and started looking into it, because I mean, it was binding up quite a bit, and so I figured, you know, it's obviously a poor fitment issue. I'll see what I can do about filing this, that, or the other, and see if I can get it running right. Because, like I said, I got it to run in binary mode, but it was just super slow. You know, I mean, I could watch the bolts come home, you know, which is not a very fast rate of fire. If you're trying to increase the rate of fire and you can sit there and have a conversation about how slow the bolt is moving while the bolt is coming home, that's not an overly good sign. So I was like, okay, I'll take it apart and I'll maybe, you know, try to file it down. I haven't done anything to it because I got it apart to take, so I took it apart to file it down, because I figure, you know, the resting blade is getting in the way, and I know that it's hitting the magazine, so obviously the resting blade is going to need to be dealt with, and maybe the hammer comes up too much. So I took it apart and decided, okay, I'll get to work on filing it. And come to find out that one of the front pins here actually broke in the course of fire. You can see just a little nub of the pin that's coming through. And then the other part of the pin is here in my hand. So after I disassembled it, this fell out. And it's supposed to fit right in there. Let me see if I can kind of sort of get it back into where it's supposed to be. Yeah, okay, it doesn't look pretty, but that's where it's supposed to be. What had happened evidently is that in the course of firing, of course you have the bolt carrier moving back under the full force of the round being fired, and evidently this thing was sitting high enough in the receiver that force came through and it pushed it down, and it actually cracked the little pin that was sitting on, and that's why the last magazine was actually functioning halfway decent, is because this thing had actually been lowered in the receiver by essentially breaking. So that had cracked, and that allowed it to slip down just enough that it was actually more or less functioning. Like I said, the bolt was still traveling really slowly, so if you're trying to get a fast rate of fire, yeah, that's not going to work. But yeah, it broke. So what does that tell me? It tells me that the PSA AK-47 and the Fostech trigger are not exactly drop-in assemblies, and even on an AK, if it's not sliding freely, it is indeed reason to be concerned. Now, like I said, this one, it has a little spot where it pauses anyways, and so it didn't bug me that much with the Fostech, but when I started shooting it today, it was getting caught up with, you know, firing live cartridges pretty much all the time. Like I said, until the last magazine, I would have multiple stoppages per magazine. A lot of times, you know, like every second round, every third round at best, until I got to the last magazine, and I think that's where that pin broke, and it allowed the trigger assembly just to come down low enough to keep things from getting too interrupted. So after taking it out and seeing that the pin was broken, I was like, well, that's obviously not going to work. So I went ahead and put the factory guts back in the gun, and that is how I plan on running it. I'm not saying that the Fostech Echo trigger is necessarily bad. I'm just saying that it doesn't fit in the PSA AK-47 GF3 very well. And if you do put it in there, you're probably at the very least going to have some very major fitment issues. And if you don't take care of those fitment issues from the beginning, like I didn't do, you're very likely to have what I had, and that was the assembly basically break itself in the process of being used. So where does that leave me? Well, it leaves me several $100 poor in the sense that I have this device that I paid several $100s on, but it's of no use to me because it's broken. You know, and it, you know, left in an unadulterated state, it was not accomplishing the purpose for which I bought it. So I'm going to email Fostech about it and see what they're willing to do. You know, like a lot of companies that make these kinds of products, they pretty much, you know, eschew all responsibility for everything. They do not guarantee anything. And to a certain extent, I understand it because with AKs, there's lots of different size variants out there, and also PSA is not known for playing particularly well with other companies when it comes to sizes and shapes of things. They like to make a lot of compatible things, but they just don't always play all that well. For example, PSA made a copy of the Russian 9mm subgun, the Vityaz, except they didn't. They decided to go with CZ Scorpion magazines. It has a different barrel length. It takes non-specialized furniture. It takes basically regular AK furniture. All kinds of things about it that make it very much so not an actual Vityaz. But it's kind of inspired by, but not really. PSA just kind of tends to do their own thing. So part of the reason why the Fostech trigger didn't work in that might simply because PSA's AKs, you know, just simply are kind of their own thing, and they have their own sizes. You know, a lot of the furniture add-ons are very compatible, but the way that they arrange the fire control group, heighten the receiver, and all those kinds of things seem to be fairly unique to them. Even the way they did their little retaining plates is a different kind of retaining plate than a lot of AKs have. Just everything that they did about the fire control group seems to be fairly unique, and so, you know, given that the Fostech was made for basically non-US made AKs, I'm thinking that's probably where the problem lies. So yeah, unless you're willing to do a lot of fitments, I would say that the Fostech is kind of useless for the PSA AK-47 GF3s. If you're willing to go through the process of getting it properly fitted and all that, it might be worth it. But given how rough this thing was running when it was in there, it's a pretty major fitment issue. You'd have to take a lot of material off the top of this thing to get it to run right. And if it's off the blade, the little safety blade, that's probably not a super critical thing. The system can probably take that. But if you need to take material off of the hammer, well, then you can really be messing with reliability and whatnot when you do that. So I'm not so sure about that. But anyways, like I said, I'm going to email Fostech about it and see what they can do for me or not. It'd really suck to spend all that money on this thing and not be able to get any functional use out of it. But yeah, I'm sure there's probably ways that can be done, but in terms of just drop in ready to go, my experience would indicate that PSA AK-47 GF3s and Fostech AK-47 Echo binary triggers are not truly drop-in compatible. At minimum, there's going to be some pretty major fitments, pretty major filing on one side or the other or both, and I'm just not sure that it's worth it. You know, I'm sure that if I sent everything into Fostech, that they could probably get me something that would work. But you guys know me, I don't like having to send my guns in somewhere. The reason why I bought the gun is so that I could have the gun. It usually takes me a while to get the gun in the first place because it's mail ordered and then waiting at the FFL and all those things, and I'm usually on the road most of the time. I do not like playing with the mail system any more than I have to once I have the gun. Now, other people probably won't mind it as much, and it might be a good option for them. Or if you just simply have a non-US made AK that is fairly standard, and to their credit, Fostech does have a list of AK-47 variants out there that they've tested it with, and they say, okay, we know these ones work, and the PSA GF3 was not on that list, so you know, that one's kind of on me in that regard. But I figured, you know, PSA made a decent product otherwise, maybe it will be compatible, and turns out it's not. But yeah, right now I'm rather disappointed with this thing. It was not a very fun experience. Like I said, it would malfunction, you know, every other round or every 3 rounds, right up until it broke, and then it actually started running halfway decent, but still that bolt was so slow that, you know, the whole benefit of getting a binary trigger is, you know, basically completely negated. So that's my experience. Short of it is PSA AK-47 GF3 variants plus the Fostech AK-47 Echo binary trigger are not drop-in compatible. Possibly it could be done with fitment, but it would be very major fitment. These really do not mesh up. It's not close and just taking, you know, a little bit, doing just a little bit of file work or a little bit of Dremel work. You're talking about removing basically most of the upper blade here, the front section here, and possibly having to take out some material on the hammer and maybe some of the grooves on the back here in order to get it to all fit properly. At least if my PSA AK-47 is anything to go by, and this particular example of the trigger is anything to go by. Really, really major fitments that a good number of people I don't think are going to want to have to go through. Doesn't mean it doesn't work with other, there aren't other combinations of other manufacturers with other guns that'll probably be just fine on, but this particular one, no. Alright, so thank you all very much for your time and attention. Have a good one. Bye.